Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 38 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm back here with Curt and Jerry today, and I'm really fascinated about our topic today. I titled this episode Rethinking Resiliency, and I want to explore from all three of our perspectives, what is resiliency? It's a word that gets thrown around quite a bit now, and especially in the trauma-informed arena. So we're going to take a deeper dive into this, talking about resiliency, what's the difference, if there is any difference between resiliency and post-traumatic growth, and just really to take some time to explore this concept in a lot more detail. So this is something I've been thinking a lot about, so it's always nice to make my bright, shiny object of the week episode number 38. So excited to be back here, and as always, we start our episodes out with our bright, shiny objects of the week, and I'll go ahead and give a start. I just want to throw a shout out. It's been a while since we've done this, to Molly Hibbert, my good friend. I know she's a listener of the show, and she did our intro and exit music. I think it was episode like 3 or 4 that she got those to me to make us look a little bit more professional. So those are custom music designed just for our episodes, and it's been fun to watch Molly go into private practice. You can find more out about Molly. She's in the Denver metro area at 6 Beats. So it's the number 6 and then BEET.com. And I know I would get a lot of support from both Jerry and Curt on this. We've been huge fans of music therapy. And if you've ever worked with a great music therapist, it's just sort of a beautiful, magical thing to watch. As somebody who loves music and listens to music constantly and has actually bought musical instruments because I thought if I bought them, I could play them at some point. Music has been such a big part of my life. I love it. I'm not all that good at it, though I know you have to practice to get good at it too. And it's just amazing to watch a good music therapist work with kids, adults, and what they can do. So she also wanted me to throw a shout out to the American Music Therapy Association at musictherapy.org. She says there's a lot of really good information there, and I'm sure we'll have an episode at some point around that specific topic. But just a shout out to Molly, also her husband Travis, who I know listens every week as well. So we love you, Molly and Travis. Thanks for the music, and yeah, check out her website at 6 Beats. Really cool stuff. So that's my bright, shiny object of the week this week. So Curt, what about you, my friend?
I've been using quite a few TED Talks to help me in presentations and in team meetings. And I have one of my favorites that I watched recently that keeps reminding me of how fun the work that I get to do can be and that we're involved in can be. And it's a TED Talk by a guy named Chris Bliss. It's called Comedy is Translation. And really is about, I mean, there's this great section of it about how when we talk about things that can be different than what we currently think, that our brain has an automatic kind of defense mechanism to that. And that he uses humor as a way to circumvent that automatic defense mechanism. And it's a great entertaining talk. So it was really fun to see. I haven't seen it in a while, and I used it again recently, and it made me smile and it made me kind of laugh again, thinking about how humor can be such a positive aspect of our communication styles. And it was a great one. It certainly just gave me a nice feeling for a good week.
Very cool. Send me that link and I'll throw that up on the show notes as well. I think I've seen that one, but I want to make sure. So cool. Jerry, what about you, my friend?
Bright, shiny objects this week. You know that I had a grandbaby last week. And so this week, I want to kind of recognize lactation coaches. Is so many.
Didn't see that one coming, Jerry. But
I know that, but in some ways, supporting mothers is so important in preventing the kind of outcomes for children that we end up talking about on these episodes. That some of the people that are involved in supporting young mothers really need a level of recognition, and I really I was really impressed and how important it is for a new mom to feel supported and feel that people are around to educate them to make sure that the baby and them are getting off to a good start. So that was where this week I had an opportunity to observe it and really admire the people that show up around for young mothers in our communities. So here's to lactation coaches.
Awesome. I didn't even know that was a thing, so I've learned something already on the podcast. So
Next time we get together, we're going to have a toast to lactation coaches.
absolutely. Absolutely.
You know, they're all important.
Hey, you learn something every day.
That's how under the radar they move.
Very cool. Well, let's jump into the topic here. And I kind of want to start this out by getting as simple as I can, because we get pretty complex pretty quickly. So I Googled the word resiliency, and what popped up in the Google dictionary thing right at the top of the page is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulty or toughness. And one of the things that I've sort of thought about recently is that I've heard the word resiliency thrown around a lot in the trauma-informed arena, and I think that's a good thing. I think anytime we just don't want to talk about trauma, we want to talk about the positive aspects of it, the hope for growth and recovery, and resiliency is definitely a part of that. But sometimes I wonder if we're throwing this word around too loosely. And Jerry, we kind of talked a little bit about this, so I'll kind of I'll set you up with this question is, when I think about at least this core definition of resiliency, the ability to bounce back quickly, I think, and I look for resiliency in the work that I do is, a lot of times what I see is if you want to see resiliency, I see it a lot of times with those experiencing homelessness, those struggling to manage an addiction, sort of folks that are living in situations, maybe a domestic violence survivor, that oftentimes, I mean, not to get too dark, but people don't survive those situations. And yet we know that there are this group of people that seem, even though they get knocked down sometimes several times a day, they're able to get up the next morning and face life. But it's not like the type of resilience naturally that's going to allow them to get up one morning and just change everything in their situation. Go get a job, go get permanent housing, and really use that resiliency to make immediate changes in their lives. So I want to just kind of throw, again, that initial definition and sort of my question out to you as first is that resiliency? And it doesn't seem to be the goal that we have for people, but there seems to be something there, a great amount of strength that allows people to survive at the same time.
Let me start out by kind of saying one thing. As you talk about resiliency and that people bouncing back, we've got to be careful because sometimes when we throw out the word resilient, it's almost like we're blaming the victim for not being able to manage their situation. So, resilience, as we've kind of talked about on these podcasts, is not something we're just born with. You're exposed to certain pattern repetitive experiences within the context of a relationship that calibrates your nervous system to be able to be more robust and be able to kind of manage levels of stress and develops a wider window of tolerance. So in one way, saying that somebody is not resilient, that's why they're not bouncing back, is in some ways not kind of honoring the experiences they've been through. But I want to also think about things in a little different way around resilience, because you know, I heard Martin Tesh out of McLean Hospital up in Boston talk about, you know, that the brain has this incredible capacity to change and adapt in response to experience. And so for many of the individuals that we see that are homeless, or we see that are in domestic violence situations, we see, in a way, their biology has begun to change and adapt to living in those situations. And so if you would take me and put me in the same situation, I might not be able to manage it. And so we look at them and say, they're not resilient, and I'm resilient, yet I can't manage that situation. And I'd like to kind of change the frame a little bit. Is adaptation has allowed us to live in very harsh environments throughout our history on the planet. Mm-hmm. And the difficulty comes sometimes is when somebody's biology has adapted to living in harsh environments, and then we want to have them live in a different environment, they appear not very resilient. Yeah. Right? And so in a way, we're talking about adaptation rather than a built-in resilience that kind of look at it, and that it takes hundreds of thousands of repetitions to, in some ways, mold the nervous system to adapt to an environment. It also takes hundreds of thousands of repetitions to change it, to kind of look at that. So that we have to look at and honor how incredibly adaptive we are as a species. But that also means that we can adapt to really negative things, mm-hmm. as well as adapt to positive things. So I'd like to throw out, maybe talk to Curt a little bit about this concept of resilience being this capacity to adapt to the environment and the environmental demands. And that may look like, in a different environment, like a maladaptive or a lack of resilience.
And there was an author, and I forget the name of the author. This was in some article I was probably reading in graduate school that made the argument that there is no such thing as maladaptive behavior. It's all adaptive, 100% of it. Like everything we're doing is to adapt to whatever situation that we're in. I thought that was an interesting point, you know, that the author was making. And it making me think of one of my first experiences with recognizing the overlap in some of the values and the philosophies that underlie a trauma-informed approach with the approach that I was trained in, which is a radical behavioral approach. And one of those first overlapping concepts is that it was in a trauma training that I was in, and the trainer put up a slide that said, one of the fundamental underlying beliefs of being trauma-informed and adopting a trauma-informed approach is the belief that everybody is doing the best that they can with what they've got where they are, mm-hmm. which is a great way of you know, kind of flowering up their adapting. Right? And from the training that I had at that point, I translated that to be behavior has a function, and that in the environment that it's in, it serves a function. And so that was a pretty important kind of time for me to be able to translate between those two things that I was hearing and start to find some overlap between the two. Recently, I was asked a question about, this is for I think a position paper about the shortage of people who are trained and licensed or certified in in applied behavior analysis within the state of Colorado. We have a huge shortage in the state of Colorado for that. And somebody asked me the question, why do we need people who are trained in this approach? And I think this is true also of people well trained in being trauma sensitive and trauma informed, is that I said the big reason why is that when I see assessments and case conceptualizations come out of school districts or in-home settings, even in residential settings, one of the things that I see the most is, say, in a functional behavior assessment, I will do things like, we'll say that the function of a behavior is to achieve this outcome in this setting. And when that outcome gets attributed to a characteristic of the individual, then where we look for change is no longer in the environment around that person. Then we put the blame on that person. We put the cause on that person. And that's a fundamental thing that I think is important in terms of getting well-trained professionals and people who think that way, and that we look for change in things that we can actually have some influence over, like what that person's environment is, or how to understand what their experiences in the past have been leading into now they're in this new environment where it's not the same as what they've adapted to. So yeah. I think those are really important points that really can kind of transcend across multiple disciplines when we start thinking about what it really means to be trauma informed. It really is this idea that people are doing the best that they can with what they've got where they are, and they have adapted to a certain set of circumstances. And when they're in a different one, as you said, Jerry, they're going to appear not resilient. And rather than placing the cause of behavior on some kind of internal characteristic flaw, it's in looking at how the environment has changed and how the learning history has contributed to it. And I love bringing in the other aspects of understanding how their early relationships have contributed to that, and how their physiology and biology contributes to that, how brain development contributes to that. I think all of those things start to expand our understanding of what we're seeing in the moment that is really, really helpful.
So this is kind of where I've got with my thinking as well. And you know, I use this, it's sort of a joke in my trainings, but I think it sort of captures this, and our listeners knows that I've gone through an obsessive binge of the Walking Dead zombie show. And one of the jokes that I say in my trainings is, if the zombie apocalypse happens, don't come to my house, because I don't have the adaptive skills to survive the zombie apocalypse. There's where you want to go down to the shelter, because those folks know how to survive out on the street. And so when we talk about resiliency in kind of how it's thrown around in our field in a very general way, are we really, because what I'm hearing from you is we're really talking about a set of coping skills in some ways, because again, a lot of people don't live through homelessness. They end up dead. A lot of people don't live through an addiction long enough to get the services to gain sobriety or recovery at some point. So when we throw around resiliency, are we really talking about, hey, you know, somebody's been able to at least develop a set of coping skills to survive their situation? And I think sometimes I also, as you guys are talking, you know, I think about the difference of how we see someone, you know, that may have been born and grew up in the United States and is now experiencing homelessness, from a refugee who survived Syria, for example, and came over here. Again, we're probably going to say the survivor of Syria, because we assume that that's not their fault and homelessness is somebody's fault, which is, again, hopefully something we've dispelled pretty much in this podcast already. We look at those a little bit differently. So, you know, both of those folks have developed coping skills, again, that are adaptive to help them survive in those situations. And so again, my question, to simplify it, is that resiliency, are we really talking about a set of coping skills that helps them survive a specific environment? Is that kind of where we're at with resiliency?
So, Matt, you live in a place that's a mile high. if when you have friends come out from Indiana or from back east and they come here, they're not initially resilient to the altitude,
Right.
right? Would you say that you're using a coping skill to kind of breathe? Your body has adapted, right? It's not, it's an adaptation that you've kind of gone through, right? Yes, I developed certain skills to kind of, I know how to find food and I know how to kind of, but there's actually a physiological alteration of living in certain environments that we end up having the ability to adapt to. And when we do that for a prolonged amount of time, those states become traits of ours, right? To kind of look at that. And so in a way, there's a number of people that have really done a great job of this in trauma work, like Janae Fisher, and talking about or looking at and really asking trauma survivors their symptoms is part of their strategy for adapting, right? And so how do you help them, not just us, but how do you help them honor those? As opposed to thinking about it as a negative about themselves, thinking about a sense of shame. But they've had to survive through incredible negative experiences that have generated intense negative affect states for them. And so they've developed strategies to deal with that. We've talked about on the show attachment. Really, an attachment isn't I don't have an attachment. I don't have an insecure attachment. I have an insecure attachment strategy. If I had to kind of adapt to living within a caregiver who was either not present or overly intrusive, I had to develop a strategy to live with that person and develop. So I develop a strategy to kind of, and then that strategy begins to alter my neurobiology, my nervous system. And so now I'm primed to live in a world in which people aren't there to effectively meet your needs. So in a way, I want to be careful because we use coping strategies as we teach people coping strategies which is really good, right? But I think we're talking about a much different kinds of adaptation than just coping strategies.
It sounds like one of the challenges that I think that we have when we talk about models, right? And we go from, models are really helpful to try and go from one level of analysis to a different level of analysis, right? So what we're kind of taking is a concept from how the stress response and a physiological response becomes either sensitized or tolerant to certain events, and that a certain pattern of events creates what we call vulnerability, right? Which could be sensitization to something, meaning a larger than normal response to a normal level of event, or it can become tolerance to, which means we have a smaller than normal level response to a particular event. And that resilience is when there's a lot of room, a lot of bandwidth to do that, right? So that's a kind of a physiological fact that we know about the stress response. And then when we try and take that,
Curt, can I have you explain? I think you hit on something really
sure.
critical. The bandwidth thing. You just blew my mind a little bit. I don't want you to jump past that. Can you explain that?
Well, we go right back to the window of tolerance episode. Right. So when we talk about bandwidth, it's how much room do you have before you become sensitized, or before you become tolerant, or before you go outside of your window of tolerance. So the wider that is, the more we would say that response is resilient, as it can go through a lot of different experiences and still maintain a relatively normal level of functioning. So when we take that from a very kind of circumscribed, narrow understanding of the world, and now what we're starting to talk about, right, Matt, when you start bringing up things like coping strategies and learning, and then we're talking at a different level of analysis, which is the organism, not just a part of the organism. Now we're talking about the organism as a whole. And when we're talking about the organism as a whole, we start talking about thinking and behavior and talking and all of those things that are the result of a combination of systems. And so the level of analysis is entirely different. And we're taking a concept that's useful at this higher level of analysis, but when you stretch it too far, like the analogy starts to get a little stretched.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of what you're talking about when you say, maybe we haven't thought this whole resiliency thing through, because we took it from a very narrow understanding of a specific part of an organism, and we're trying to apply it to the whole organism, and the analogy gets stretched.
All right, so let me sum up what I think where we're at this point, because I'm loving this. Okay, so we've got let's have somebody, you know, in that traumatic situation. Let's just say, you know, that's surviving homelessness and addiction, is they've developed a certain set of traits that allow them to stay alive, at least in that scenario. But to bring in what Curt said, is their bandwidth is pretty short. So while they can survive in that short bandwidth, which is an incredible amount of strength to survive in that bandwidth, the fact that they've had to focus so much energy on surviving that short bandwidth of homelessness and addiction doesn't really give them, if we use the word resiliency, to translate that success into other areas of their life. Jerry's shaking his head. Dude, I thought I had a good insight here, Jerry.
Go ahead.
No, what's your thought? You're shaking your head. I thought I had a breakthrough.
Let me take a shot, and then Curt could tell us.
All right.
He's right. I'm trying to incorporate. Because this individual lives in an environment where there's scarcity of resources, where there's lack of shelter, where there's in some ways challenges even with temperature that you're going to look like, right?
Threats of violence, yeah.
They become really good at managing those situations. So they develop a tolerance to those types of situations, right? They may actually, so for them in that environment, they're not having the physiological reaction. Their body is not reacting to the temperature demands the same way mine would, to the right to do it. That doesn't mean when they go into another environment that the different cues, that they may actually be hypersensitive to certain things in different environments, right? So when you go and they walk into, say, for example, a service delivery system and the person doesn't respond to them quickly, they may be reactive in that environment where they were in some ways tolerant in another environment. And so I think what Curt's trying to say is, what we look at resilience is this lack of reaction, when really at a very basic level, when we get down to physiology, we're talking about the development of tolerance for certain things. And in other situations, the sensitization of the system in certain things. And we call tolerance resilience, right? So that's how I'm trying to understand what Curt said.
And Curt,
let's just check. Does that make sense what you said?
Let me throw one more, just to Jerry, with ability to stay engaged in prefrontal cortex functioning, just to throw that question on top of Jerry's.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know.
That's a whole nother level.
That's a whole other thing.
I knew this was a good question.
So let me ask you, Matt, it is in the environment that you've adapted to, where you've developed tolerance, is thinking an adaptive response to what I have to deal with. Is stopping and processing and thinking through adaptive. If I have a saber-toothed tiger chasing me, would that be adaptive?
No, you want to be reactive.
So I think we're moving from saying when we're in our frontal cortex, that's adaptive. And what I think in this model we're talking about is, in some environments, that's not
Maybe
adaptive.
not. Right,
Right.
maybe not.
Does that make sense,
Right.
Curt?
Right. So then if you had been both from a physiological just conditioning standpoint and from a more operant or voluntary kind of standpoint, learned how to deal with the environment that you could tell somebody about, right? Like, pay attention to those weeds over there because there's a snake in there.
Yeah.
I went over there one time, I found it.
And drink, because we said operate. So if it's happy hour when you're listening to this, it's operate. So take a drink.
It's been 6 months since I said that word.
So I mean, let's get back to I've got a second follow-up question to this, but so when we use the word resiliency, let's just take it from a strength-based perspective because we want to bring out the strengths. Really, we can use the word resiliency to talk about someone's ability to survive adverse situations. I think I mean, if you look at just the dictionary definition of being able to recover, and I think this gets tricky again, but we could say someone who's experienced chronic homelessness for a decade or so has a level of resiliency. We just have to, I think, acknowledge, and this was what I was kind of getting at, it's resiliency isn't necessarily the end goal per se of trauma recovery in and of itself. Oh, I love the silence here.
I'm not sure I understand the question. That's why.
So you know, when a lot of times what I hear out there is, well, we want to replace the trauma, the suffering. If we can help these people become resilient, that's the goal of a trauma-informed intervention. And I've heard resiliency informed and other things out there, which again, I love the positive language. And I think I'll ask that follow-up question now is when I do trainings, I often use a model of trauma recovery based on Joseph Campbell's model, The Hero's Journey. So on one side of the journey, I think I have to set this up to make it make any sense. There's trauma, which leads to pain, suffering, and what Campbell calls the abyss, which you can think about as homelessness, depression, you know, whether it's internal to the person or in the environment and obvious. So in some ways, there's potentially something we could call resiliency that allows the individual to survive trauma, the aftermath of trauma, and the challenges that they face in their life. But I also think we would agree, and this is kind of where I want to shift the conversation to, is that there's also something called post-traumatic growth, which I do see as sort of one of the end goals of our interventions. And that's on the other side of the hero's journey, where someone comes in and helps the person find hope for a better future, and then they go through this transformational process where they gain wisdom and strength from their past trauma, having overcome that experience. And yeah, so I'm sort of wondering, I think the question I want to explore now is post-traumatic growth a type of resiliency? Maybe something I've heard it kind of talked about. They're not specifically resiliency to. I've seen that in the literature, but are we talking, when we talk about post-traumatic growth and recovery, a special type of resiliency where we're not just getting back up, but we're getting back up, gaining wisdom and strength from the experience of being knocked down?
Well, maybe.
Stop right there. Stop right there.
Hey, that gives you a lot of bandwidth to play with, my friend. Right on,
stop the recording.
Here.
Maybe if we go back to, let's go all the way back to the thought of, this comes from a lot of Bruce Perry's writing, right? He'll talk a lot about early on in our evolutionary history, how we lived in family groups. Within a family group, you really had one kind of set of social structures that you needed to know. And you didn't need to know lots and lots of different social structures across multiple groups. that may be a difference between then and now, right? Now, one of the things that I think is quite important to functioning in today's world is being able to cross social structures a lot and be able to adapt to a lot of them. So now if we kind of take that as something that is an important outcome, and we could argue all day long whether or not that's an important outcome, but for sake of the story that I'm telling, I will say that's an important outcome. Listeners can chime in on whether or not they think that's an important outcome or not.
Well, let me just set that up. So somebody
experiencing
homelessness going into a stable
That's
environment
relevant.
and an employment environment. So I think you're onto something.
I just say this, one of the things that is fascinating about this topic to me is it is incredible where Matt can find a social justice issue.
Thank you. I take that as a compliment, so thank you.
You have a talent. So let's say you've got I'm thinking of an individual right now who I talked to just yesterday to some of his team. And one of their real challenges with him is that when he has some kind of perceived slight that happens, a relatively small stressor, that's a pretty small stressor to me. When I feel like I didn't get what I wanted, in a pretty small way, I didn't get my coffee the way I wanted it this morning, small stressor to me. He's in a position where in his history, that is not a small stressor. He has a much larger than normal response to that event. He's been sensitized to it. So his stress response goes from calm all the way to alarmed and, almost in fight or flight by one small little event, at least small to me relatively, right? And so he'll then call multiple people. He's in a community placement. So he'll call his manager, the house manager, and he'll go through a chain of people and he'll call all of them. And he's so activated that he will tell them that he wants to kill himself and he wants to kill other people. That's where his stress response is, right? You get that activated, the urge to harm other people and retaliate gets really, really strong. It's a part of the biology. So for him, that sensitization, which we could, in one sense, Matt, in your sense, he's done that, really, he's learned that as a strategy to deal with his world.
Right.
Right. He doesn't, I know I've learned that if I don't get my coffee at one place the way I want it, I go to another one. I'm fine. I have a strategy for dealing with that. The strategy he has learned over time to deal with that is that he doesn't have the idea that I can go to another place, or I haven't learned I can go to another place. And maybe he doesn't have the money to go to another place. Variety of reasons, right? We can hypothesize about those all day long. But what he has learned is that now I need to call somebody and I'm so stressed out that I can't reason. So I'm going to call and I threaten. And he screams and he yells and that person, either they're in this position where they're like having to make a decision. Am I going to give this guy what he wants or not? Right? They're in an all or none kind of position. And maybe they don't. And then he goes on to the next person. He goes on to the next person. But that is an example of sensitization, even kind of take it at the physiological level. But then it's translated into an adaptation that is adaptive in one environment, but that sensitization, right, that response of his nervous system is now blocking his ability to adapt to a new environment.
Yeah.
Because if he wants to go into another environment, which would be great, right? We can all, I think, agree on that. It would be a wonderful thing if this young man could learn that if he asked somebody nicely, they'd probably buy him another cup of coffee. Right? But he's the sensitization is blocking his ability to do that.
Yeah.
And that's when resiliency and vulnerability becomes really important. A resiliency in that sense could be his stress response actually being able to tolerate this small stressor and not have such a sensitized response to it, and that can facilitate him being able to navigate, right, in what you can kind of think that he's been homeless for a significant portion of his life. And so his learning of how to respond this way to small slights is understandable. We can get it. And it would be very useful if he were ever homeless again that he could utilize that to survive in that world. But we also want him to be able to adapt to this new world where asking nicely gets you things, and where responding to small slights with being gracious gets you lots of things. It gets you lots of access to things in this new environment that would not be operating in this other environment that he learned all these strategies in.
Yeah, so if he would be able to learn a sort of from his experience and increase bandwidth.
The increase of the bandwidth, right? So if we could, and now think of it from a, like, totally take thinking out of this entirely.
Yeah.
Let's think it from a straight, just conditioning standpoint. If we could condition his nervous system so that when he didn't get that cup of coffee, I'm just throwing that out there as a stupid example, right? So that small stressor no longer generates a sensitized response. His ability to learn to navigate in another environment or be resilient would be increased. So the resilience of his stress response in his nervous system would allow him to kind of go up this other level of learning, right? Where we're talking about coping strategies, and we're talking about thinking strategies, and we're talking about much more complex collections of systems resulting in behavior at the organism level.
Yeah.
So that's where that analogy can kind of help in crossing that divide between different levels of analysis.
Great.
And that can help him.
And so if we threw in there, I want to bring that post-traumatic growth, and I imagine this guy, and this could be years later, but now he's standing in line at the local coffee shop and he sees somebody else blow up. You know, he could then sort of intervene and say, hey, man, it's not that big of a deal. So then he's able to apply his experiences eventually to help others. Would we, Jerry, I know you've thought a lot about post-traumatic growth. I just kind of want to get your thoughts about, is post-traumatic growth a type of resiliency? I think that's what Curt and I are trying to kind of get to. I just kind of love to get your thoughts on that question in general.
So there's multiple avenues that you can address these situations, right? Mm-hmm. Just from a physiological perspective, think about that his amygdala has been conditioned, emotionally conditioned to respond to certain cues in the environment. And so whenever those environmental stimuli is there, his body reacts. Mm-hmm. That's not a cognitive process, that's a physiological process, right? But we also know that that is never going to go away. That in order to extinguish that response, extinction happens at a cortical level, right? So that the amygdala goes off, but now you develop capacities to inhibit that response, to do it. But we also know that that doesn't occur outside the context of a supportive relationship. So that you need to have a supportive environment. And that it starts with physiological cues in the body. And so there's multiple models that people have developed to intervene at different levels of this process, right? You can intervene at the behavioral level. You can intervene at the cognitive level. You can intervene at the somatic sensory level to kind of look at. But ultimately, what you're talking about is when I have this reaction in my body, I develop the capacity either to have internal capacities to regulate that, or I'm able to utilize relationships to help me interactively regulate it. And when I have that experience, now I develop a new narrative. And so now when my body reacts, I say to myself, oh, I have a need for coffee. I have alternative strategies to get that coffee. And there's different narrative there. So now when I'm now that I have a new narrative, if I ever am in the coffee shop and I see somebody getting angry, I have a different physiology. I have that response, but now I have different coping mechanisms internally to manage that response, but I have a different narrative. So now I could tell this other person, hey, it's not the end of the world, right? I can't tell that person until I develop a different narrative, because the part of our brain that communicates our internal experience with each other people in words, is really the last piece to change.
Yeah.
Right? So when that occurs, that's what you're defining, or the literature defining, as post-traumatic growth, is that we now have a new narrative to define what's happening in our bodies, to kind of look at that piece. And when we do that, we develop increased tolerance for those experiences. So following through in treatment, I've got to help somebody develop the capacity to not only identify what's happening in their bodies, but to develop the capacity to tolerate, modulate it, eventually to be able to put some language to it, and eventually be able to express it. That's a treatment process that goes on to be able, and that for many people, because the language part is not there, we intervene at a much lower level. And for other people who actually are functioning really well, but they have these association of certain cues, they may be able to utilize cognitive verbal therapies to kind of look at that. So for example, if I'm really a healthy person, but I was in a car accident, I might be able to engage in this relationship. So different therapies become really good to have in your toolbox, based on, as opposed to one's right and wrong, is what is the best level of intervention for this particular client to help them move through these different stages towards what you're defining as post-traumatic growth.
Yeah. So let me, I want to kind of sum this up a little bit. So would we agree with this statement? Let me just ask that, is whatever we want to call it, let's just call it Resiliency 1 and Resiliency 2, just for simplicity. But there is sort of, if you look at the textbook definition of resiliency, is the ability to bounce back. There is sort of this strength, we call it traits and coping skills, to survive situations that, again, honestly, a lot of people don't live through. So there is sort of a strength that develops, even though it might be situational specific. And then there's a type of resiliency where there is a strength and wisdom gained from that strength. So there's the ability to survive, and then there's sort of a secondary resiliency of transforming that strength that we use to survive that maybe more generally into the world in the form of wisdom. Is that, am I close to summing up maybe something that makes sense?
So for the sake of time, because we're running out of time a little bit, kind of looking at that.
Yes.
I think the concept of resilience is a really important concept.
Yeah.
Right? And why is it important? Because as we learn about trauma, we understand that exposure to negative events, or the lack of exposure to certain types of relational events, creates vulnerability, right? When we understand that the repetition of being under high levels of stress for a prolonged amount of time without the availability of a buffer, relational buffer, results in vulnerability, we can then understand that exposures different kinds of experiences, relational experiences, adequate food, adequate housing, all of those types of community support groups. We could build opportunities for people not necessarily to heal from trauma, but to become more healthy and more adaptable in their lives. So that what we have been under a model is we wait till people get injured, and then we run in, call them sick or call them help, and then we fix them. This knowledge allows us to build opportunities that help. Going back to my lactation coach, my daughter's building opportunities to build in health and tolerance and resilience in my grandson, that we don't have to wait till they get injured. And if they get injured, they have the capacity to use relationships. They have some internal resources, right? And they're going to, if something's not working, they're going to in some ways say, well, if I'm not getting what I need from you, I can go over here and have a different relationship.
Yeah.
We're learning more about not just what happens bad when you're exposed to bad things, but what happens when you're exposed to good things.
Those protective factors. Yeah.
How do we increase the opportunities in our society for people to be exposed to these positive things as opposed to waiting till so we're creating trauma-sensitive schools.
Yeah.
We're creating trauma-sensitive communities. We're creating, right? That is the ultimate goal. So post-traumatic growth should be for us as a society, not just for the individual. We ought to learn that keeping people in poverty and not having access to food and medical, so that ultimate results in injuring people.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So going back to your social justice model is really what we're talking about is not people who are resilient or not resilient, but people who have been exposed to prolonged levels of stress for a long amount of time, and they've had to adapt to those situations, but it created vulnerabilities for them in other situations.
Mm-hmm. And
for their own physiology, in order to maintain stability in that environment, using Bruce McEwen's model, it does a lot of allostatic load on that person, so the wear and tear on their body is going to take effect for a long amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make some sense?
It does.
So then we have to take all the knowledge we're giving in these podcasts and say, how do we create healthy experiences for people?
Right.
That result in healthy outcome for people.
And is there a way, and I like, Curt, you're because of the example that kind of comes to mind, is there a way to, if we have somebody who's been through that vulnerability cycle, again, whether it's a kid, whether it's an adult, who has gone through those struggle and challenges, is there a way as being a key part, again, of the relationship that helps them have that transformational process? Is it worthwhile to look at what strengths they use to survive? Again, if we call that resiliency one or whatever we call it, like if somebody walks in and there's a list, and I think we get overwhelmed about this no matter what part of life we get this, there's all these problems. To me, the thinking around this also is there's been a lot of strengths developed along with that experience as well. And I think that to kind of balance those two is, again, those strengths might have to look a little different to survive in a different arena of life. But, if we just look at the problems, that becomes overwhelming for everybody. I think there's a strength-based piece we can pull out of this conversation as well.
You reminded me of an example I've used a lot in my experience treating people with autism spectrum disorders. And one of the diagnostic criteria for ASD is a restricted interest in repetitive patterns. That's the kind of the collection, right? Oftentimes that can manifest itself as a reliance on rules. Right? And some of those rules become really kind of problematic for the rest of society, right? But if you teach the right rules, it becomes a strength, because the urge to follow a set of rules by somebody who is diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder can be very strong. So if you get the right ones, it becomes a real strength that you can really utilize to help in the recovery and treatment.
So Matt, one of the takeaways I think for everybody listening is, how do I build up a capacity to be tolerant to the presentation that my clients are bringing in for me? How do I approach them? How do I not go into a defensive state? How do I stay with them, right? And part of that, I think, has been this concept of, for me, is when I'm able to really have a different frame, rather than seeing their symptoms as problems, rather than seeing them as being resistant to something, I see them as surviving, and I want to understand and honor how they've developed. That allows me to approach them. So this trauma-informed approach, if you call it, or awareness of the developmental and physiological and psychological and social impact of being exposed to prolonged stress, allows us to be with our clients rather than doing something to our clients. And I see so often in treatment centers that the people that are responsible for taking care of these individuals become so sensitized and reactive that they begin to become almost aggressive in the enforcement of rules, in the enforcement of structures, that really they're not able in some ways to be resilient and bring that to the client to do it. So I think what we're trying to do is not just have post-traumatic growth for our clients, but how we conceptualize what's going on allows us to approach these individuals in a very different way and be with them and kind of honor what's going on within them, and so that they have a different experience within a relationship that allows them to begin to look at their internal experience in a different way.
I think that's a great point, Jerry. You're making me think of what we did with this gentleman I was talking about earlier who gets really escalated. And the reason why I got called was because all of this group, right, they're like, what do we do, right? And they feel stuck. And so they feel stuck in this bind that when this gentleman calls, they feel like they have two options: ignore it or give in. Right? And when you get in that kind of binary, like two options, and those are two ends of the extreme, it's one or the other. When they get in that kind of thinking as a provider, you got a big problem, because you can only do, like, there's nothing in the middle. So what we did as a strategy is to devise a list of questions that person would ask that are really related to, what this gentleman expresses, right? He expresses suicidal ideation and he expresses violence risk. Mm-hmm. So we took a whole bunch of clinical assessment tools with questions that are curious about the level of symptom activation in suicidality and in homicidality, so that we can both assess the level of risk and have more options. Mm-hmm. And you're really then playing, and I talk about this with behavior a lot. Like, behavior by its nature, as most other physical events are, is probabilistic in nature. It's always probabilistic. And so you've got to play the probabilities right. It's almost like gambling, right? It's kind of fun. So if we think about, this gentleman, right, we've got to have some other options other than ignoring or giving in that allow us to have more probabilities that things could go a different direction. Mm-hmm. And by designing that into, it really would be an on-call procedure, basically, that we could line out for everybody who's on call, that when he calls and he says this, I'm going to hurt myself, you go down this list of questions, go, tell me about that. What is that like for you? Tell me what your body is doing. Like, you go through all these lists of questions that can actually allow his stress response to start to subside.
But it also allows the responder's stress level to go down, right?
Yeah.
So the cues in the relationship become non-threatening.
Yes.
Right? And
right.
So really, that's really what a lot of this is how do we help people who are working with people who have been severely injured by life experiences not get defensive themselves? So you did a great job of, in some ways, giving, as in Matt's word, you gave them a coping strategy that allowed them to be with this individual in a different way than in some ways get organized by his stress level.
Right.
That's great. Yeah. And maybe we can explore that topic about how we stay resilient. I think that there's definitely, because again, if we lose our bandwidth, so to speak, we lose that flexibility that I think Curt just gave us a great example of. It's not just A or B. a lot of times the answer, we get very rule-based in that way, and oftentimes the answer's somewhere in between, or it's way down there at X and Z, that if we don't have that bandwidth, we may miss as well. So
like classic negotiation strategy, right? Give people two options when really there is secret option number 3 out there that I didn't.
There's always secret option number 3.
There's always 3 doors on let's make a deal.
Exactly. Well, I thought we would have an amazing conversation around this, so I appreciate this one. This was a topic that I've been thinking a lot about. So, Curt, Jerry, thank you. I'm going to be processing this. I'm imagining, I don't have a topic yet for next week, but I'm imagining I'll find a follow-up to this as well. We got some really great guests coming on too in June as well. So we got a really great month shaping up as well. I want to throw out a shout out. We got an email this morning, probably last night actually, from Susanna Lim from Melbourne, Australia, who listens to the podcast as she walks her dog. So it's fun for me to think about somebody on like the bottom of the planet way over here.
You're on the bottom of the planet.
Craziness as she walks her dogs at the bottom of the earth way over here. So I've been really enjoying that visual. So Susanna's a speech pathologist and a fan of the show. So we love to hear feedback from listeners. So throw it out there. And if you're walking your dog on the bottom of the earth, I'll be thinking about that all weekend. So I want to thank Jerry and Curt again. You can go to traumainformedlens.org. There we have show notes. We'll put Curt's TED Talk up there that he mentioned. And also, if you're listening to this as a team or want to, we also put usually about 4 or 5 discussion questions as well. So you can kind of follow this up and process it in your environment too. So guys, great conversation today. And we'll see y'all next week, and we'll let Molly play us out here like she always does. So thank you, and see everybody next week.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
day.